I'm a child of a domestic worker. My mother suffered epilepsy. She couldn't do anything for me. We stayed in a shack. We slept without food. When she came out of a bus, my mother had a scar here. She burned when she was working for whites in the domestic there in town there. When she comes out of a bus, I used to run to her because I had hoped she came back with some leftovers. And a white man wants to tell me how to live my life and tell me that I don't know what poverty does to people. I know what poverty does to people. That's why we must help our people.
South Africa is the kind of country that produces extreme contradictions and then it demands everyone to speak about them politely. This is a place where you can have one of the most progressive constitutions on earth and still have millions of people living in conditions that look like an undeclared war against the poor. This is a country where the language of reconciliation is treated like the highest form of morality, even where reconciliation itself has functioned as a delay tactic for justice. In that kind of country, a person like Julius Malema is almost inevitable. Whether you love him, hate him, fear him, or thinks he's a dangerous opportunist, Malema represents something South Africa has repeatedly tried to suppress: the return of uncompromising black anger into mainstream political life. And that is why, for all his flaws, South Africa needed him, or at least someone like him. Julius Malema rose through the ranks of the ANC Youth League, eventually becoming its president in 2008. He quickly became famous for his charisma, his confrontational style that we are all very familiar with, and his ability to say out loud what many young black South Africans felt but believed they were not allowed to express in a respectable public discourse. Malema initially positioned himself as a loyal ANC cadre, even playing kingmaker during Jacob Zuma's rise to the presidency. But as Zuma's administration became synonymous with corruption and state capture, Malema's political identity shifted from an insider to being an antagonist for that same administration. After being expelled from the ANC in 2012, he co-founded the EFF, Economic Freedom Fighters, in 2013. The EFF entered parliament in 2014 and very quickly became one of the most influential opposition forces in the country, especially amongst young people and those people that were disillusioned with the ANC's promises. Any serious discussion of Malema has to acknowledge the obvious. The man is complicated. He is not morally clean, and a lot of people would actually say that he is shady, and they would have a point. He has been repeatedly accused of corruption and unethical conduct, particularly during his time in the ANC Youth League. He has faced legal issues related to tax matters, his political style often leads into provocation, and at times he has used rhetoric that is inflammatory, it's polarizing, and is strategically reckless. There is also the critique that Malema sometimes performs radicalism rather than consistently building it, that he is brilliant at identifying pain, but less convincing at building stable long-term solutions. This means that his politics sometimes can seem more about power than about certain principles. And these critiques matter because South Africa has suffered a long time from charismatic leaders, particularly men, who speak the language of liberations while only feeding themselves and their families. But Malema's faults, while they are real, they do not cancel the political function that he has played in South Africa. It's easy to reduce white fear of Malema to simple racism, and sometimes it is, if we're being honest. But that's not the full picture. It would not be fair to the white people of South Africa to just say that if they hate Malema, it means they're racist. Malema scares white South Africans because he's one of the few mainstream politicians who speak in a way that refuses to comfort them. He does not perform the ritual many white South Africans have come to expect, the ritual of black leaders reassuring them that nothing will fundamentally change. He speaks directly about land, about wealth, about the structural nature of white privilege, about the fact that the economy still reflects apartheid's design. He does so without asking for white approval. For many white South Africans, especially for those who see themselves as not racist and believe the country has moved on from apartheid, Malema feels like a disruption of the moral of the story they've built about the post-1994 nation. Because Malema forces a question some people may not want to answer. If apartheid was so wrong and its outcomes are still visible everywhere, then what exactly are you willing to give up? That question is terrifying because it is unfair, but because it's also fair. It threatens the comfortable fantasy that justice can happen without loss. South Africa's biggest political problem is not that we lack good speeches. It's that we have normalized injustice and we call it complicated, we call it complexity, for lack of a better word. We have spent a lot of decades treating inequality like it's a natural disaster instead of a political choice. We have been trained to think of poverty as unfortunate rather than something that is engineered and is actually done intentionally by the people that are in power. And we have been taught that any strong political demand is populism, as if democracy is meant to be quiet. Malema's greatest contribution is that he reintroduced moral urgency into the political mainstream. He dragged issues that were being politely avoided back into the mainstream and back into the center. These are issues like land redistribution, nationalism, economic inequality as a political emergency, the continued racial nature of wealth, the betrayal of the working class by liberation elites. Even people who hate Malema have had to speak his language at some point. The ANC itself, especially post-2024, began echoing themes the EFF made unavoidable, and that is not a coincidence at all. Malema shifted the boundaries of what South Africans are allowed to say in public, especially in political discourse. A key reason South Africa needed Malema is because Malema is not an accident. He is a product of our system. He is what happens when young people are told that they need to be patient while they sit with unemployment, as it's currently happening right now in South Africa, when black graduates are told that they are born free while they live like people that are really just renting space in their own country. He is what happens when the state fails to deliver, but it still demands us to be loyal to it, and it's when corruption becomes normalized and there's no accountability. In many ways, Malema is South Africa's suppressed anger speaking through a person. And the truth is, if Malema didn't exist, South Africa would have produced another version of him. Because the conditions require a political figure who can embody a certain level of rage, humiliation, and the demand for dignity. South Africa's post-apartheid settlement was built on compromise. That compromise prevented civil war, and it was necessary in many ways, even though people blame Nelson Mandela for that. But I do think it was necessary. But it also came with a cost. The economic justice that was postponed. A large part of South Africa's political culture became obsessed with stability rather than transformation. And stability in a deeply unequal society usually means the poor people remain poor in just a more orderly or more organized way. Malema's role has been to expose the limits of reconciliation without redistribution. He is essentially saying, you cannot ask people to keep forgiving a system that keeps humiliating them. And that message is important because it is true even though it feels unpleasant. One of the tragedies of South African politics is how easily the liberation movement became a managerial elite. A political class that speaks about service delivery the way that corporates speak to us about customer care and not the way it should be, which is about justice. Malema, the way I see it, has brought back class back into the conversation in a way that mainstream politics had abandoned. He really reframed inequality as a structural problem that it is, and not just a failure of policy implementation. Before the EFF, opposition politics were largely framed through liberal critique. So it was just corruption, governance, institutions, and constitutionalism. And of course, these are important issues, but they are not enough in a country where the majority of people are locked out of economic life. Malema introduced a different opposition tradition, a radical, black, working class oriented critique of the entire economic settlement. And you can see this through them wearing red overalls that symbolize the working class. Even when Malema is inconsistent in his principles, he has made it impossible for the opposition politics to be only about technocratic competence. He turned parliament into a theater of confrontation, which is sometimes childish and sometimes we don't like it as South Africans, but sometimes it is brilliant and sometimes it is actually necessary. For too long, Parliament had become a place where politicians spoke as if the poor were an abstract statistic, not a lived reality. Here is the tension that I've been battling with when I'm thinking about Malema. South Africa needed Malema's disruption, but at the same time, South Africa is also vulnerable to demagogues. This is a country that has extreme inequality, and any leader that speaks a certain language in a passionate way and the language of pain like Malema does, they can also weaponize that pain. And Malema sometimes flirts with that line. That's why the best way to understand Malema is not as a hero or a villain, but as a political instrument. He reveals the truths that other people avoid, but he also sometimes exploits those truths for power. And both of those things can be true at once. The reason South Africa needed a Julius Malema is because South Africa was lying to itself for a long time. We were pretending that the post-apartheid project was working slowly but surely, while the material conditions of the majority remained very brutal, very bad. I mean, just go to any township to see the reality of this. We were really pretending that polite language meant moral maturity. We really were pretending that economic power would naturally transform over time without anyone forcing it to be so. We were pretending that the poor were being impatient. Malema disrupted those lies. He forced a national confrontation with the fact that the country's inequality is not a glitch, it's the system continuing just under the new management of the ANC, which he also was a part of at some point. Julius Malema is not the future of South Africa in a simple way. He's not a clean revolutionary, he's not a reliable moral compass, but he has played a role South Africa desperately needed. He reopened the conversation about economic justice, he legitimized anger that had been treated as irrational, he reminded the country that democracy without dignity is fragile. He challenged the idea that black leadership must always be gentle to be acceptable. South Africa needed a Julius Malema not because he's perfect, but because he represents something the country keeps trying to avoid. The reality that freedom without redistribution is not freedom. It's just us playing delay. It's just us being passive. And even if Malema disappeared tomorrow, the questions he brought to the center will remain, because South Africa cannot possibly be permanently suppressed without the demand for dignity. Not in a country that is built on dispossession, not in a country where poverty still has a color, not in a country where the future keeps arriving, but justice keeps being postponed.